The moment I read the message telling me not to come to the wedding, something inside me cracked in a way I could almost hear. It was not the shock that hurt the most. It was the clarity betrayal has a sound, a weight, a taste, and in that instant I felt every bit of it settle into my bones. I had spent years holding together a bond that had already been quietly unraveling. Thread by thread, that message did not just end a chapter. It exposed the truth I had been too afraid to face. Love can break you long before it leaves you. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let us begin. My name is Maggie Whitford, and at 66, my days move with a quiet rhythm that both comforts and unnerves me. I live alone now in the lake house. My husband and I bought decades ago, back when we believed retirement would be a season of shared mornings and slow adventures. He has been gone for 4 years, yet his presence lingers in the creak of the wooden floorboards and the way the sunrise settles on the water. Each morning, I rise before the light fully breaks, brew a pot of coffee, and sit at the small kitchen table with my worn deck of solitaire cards. It is a silly habit, perhaps, but the shuffle of the cards anchors me in a world that changed too quickly. Maple Harbor, Michigan, is a quiet town stitched together by pine trees, gravel roads, and a lake that seems to breathe with the seasons. From my porch, I can see ripples gliding across the surface of Maple Ridge Lake as if some invisible hand has brushed it gently. The air always smells faintly of cedar. The lake house itself is old, a little drafty, and full of memories. There is the loft where my husband carved wooden figurines, the rocking chair where he used to read the Sunday paper, and the lavender bushes we planted the summer before he fell ill. I tend them now with careful hands, pruning them the way he once showed me, as though doing so keeps me tethered to every part of him that remains. My neighbor, Denise, stops by often with a plate of muffins or a jar of peach jam. She claims she visits because she wants to test her recipes, but I know she worries about how quiet my house has become. We sit on the porch sometimes, talking about nothing in particular, letting the wind fill the empty spaces between our sentences. I appreciate her presence more than I let her know. My daughter, Olivia, lives far away in Portland, Oregon, running a wellness retreat called Lunar Wells Retreat. She has always been ambitious, fiercely driven, and impatient with anything that does not fit her vision of progress. When she was younger, she sought my approval constantly, flooding me with questions, stories, and dreams. But as the years passed, a distance grew. Our conversations became shorter, more transactional. Her messages often arrived without warmth, as if affection were an outdated language she no longer needed to speak. Still, I tried to reach her, sending little notes, photos of the lake, updates on my garden, hoping something would pull her back. Some afternoons, I walk along the lake, counting the stones that line the path and listening to the wind rustle through the cattails. Other afternoons, I find myself lingering in my husband's old workshop, touching his chisels, smelling the faint trace of sawdust as if it were an extension of him. Life feels steady but fragile, like a glass ornament suspended by a thin thread. Lately, small things have unsettled me. A letter addressed to me arrived without a return address, only for a courier to retrieve it the next day. Olivia has not called in nearly 3 weeks, though she used to check in every Sunday. And 2 nights ago, Denise mentioned seeing a stranger near my gate, standing perfectly still before disappearing into the trees when she approached. This evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, I stood on the porch and watched the lake turn to liquid copper. A strange heaviness pressed against my chest, prompting me to open my journal. I wrote one simple line before closing the book. Something in the air feels uncertain tonight. I did not know then how quickly that uncertainty would swell into something that would devour the quiet life I clung to. If you're still watching, and this beginning has pulled you in, comment number 1 below, so I know you're here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The morning began with a heaviness I could not quite name. The sky over Maple Ridge Lake looked bruised, a muted gray that pressed low enough to touch the tops of the pine trees. I moved through the kitchen with my usual routine, yet even the smallest gestures felt off balance. When I reached for the jar of sugar, my hand slipped and the spoon clattered across the counter, scattering grains like tiny shards of frost. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the crystals melt against the warmth of my palm, feeling as though the day had shifted a fraction out of place. I considered calling Olivia. It had been weeks since we last spoke, and the silence between us had begun to settle into something dense and uncomfortable. My thumb hovered over her name in my phone. A familiar ache tightened in my chest, the kind that comes from wanting connection and fearing rejection. In equal measure, I set the phone down without pressing the button. Not long after, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. A small brown parcel lay on the mat, wrapped with the neat twine and bearing no return address. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it with a paring knife. Inside, on both sides, nestled in tissue, was a glossy brochure from Lunar Wells Retreat. The cover displayed an elaborate floral arch overlooking a stone garden. Beneath it was a cream-colored card embossed with gold lettering, announcing a reservation for a wedding gala. There was no recipient listed, no explanation. I stared at the card longer than I should have, unable to shake the feeling of something carefully hidden behind it. A little later, Denise arrived with a basket of scones. She always said she baked too much, although I suspected she visited more for the company. As I poured tea, she shared a story from the local market about a vendor who mentioned someone in Maple Harbor preparing for a grand wedding out west. I felt a faint chill move through me. The world is small, but not that small. For a brief moment, a thought flickered toward Olivia, but I brushed it aside. Assumptions have a way of wounding long before the truth arrives. After Denise left, I found myself restless. I tried calling Olivia. The phone rang 5 times before routing to voicemail. I listened to the silence on the other end, imagining her in some meeting room, too busy to notice my name on the screen. I almost called again, but something in me hesitated. The distance between us no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like a boundary I did not know how to cross. Later that afternoon, I walked into my husband's old workshop, seeking the comfort of familiar scents. Dust, cedar, and the faint memory of him lingered there. That was when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I reached for it absently, expecting perhaps a message from Denise. Instead, a short line of text from Olivia stared back at me with a cold, sterile glow. "Do not show up to the wedding. We are finished." The room seemed to tilt. I read the message again, then again, hoping it might rearrange itself into something less brutal. A ringing sound filled my ears, drowning out everything except the pounding of my heart. Images of Olivia, as a child, rose unbidden, her small hand gripping mine as we crossed the street, her laughter echoing across the lake, her proud smile when she learned to ride her bicycle. Each memory felt like a door closing. I typed slowly, steadying my breath, refusing to let my hand shake. "Got your last wish." The words were plain, but beneath them swirled a tide of heartbreak I could not fully name. When I looked out the workshop window, the lake had darkened, ripples breaking across its surface. A wind pushed hard against the trees, bending their branches as if warning of an approaching storm. I watched the water churn, and felt the first fracture in the quiet life I had built since losing my husband. The lake was no longer calm, and neither was I. If you're still watching and feeling the tension building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following the trail. Now, let's step into chapter 3. I barely slept after receiving Olivia's message. The words replayed in my mind with a sharpness that refused to dull, each repetition carving deeper into the quiet I once relied on. By the time dawn pulled a pale line across the sky, I felt hollowed out, as though part of me had slipped away during the night. The lake house, usually a place of refuge, seemed to echo with every creak of the floorboards, as if the walls themselves sensed the fracture in my life. I made coffee, but hardly tasted it. My thoughts kept circling the same impossible question. What could drive my daughter to sever our relationship with such cold finality? I tried to reason through every memory of the past year, searching for hints or signs that I might have missed. Nothing made sense. The harder I tried to find clarity, the more clouded everything became. In an attempt to distract myself, I sat down at the small desk in the living room and opened my laptop. My intention had been to browse the news or check emails, anything mundane. Instead, almost without thinking, I opened my online banking portal. It was something I rarely visited, trusting the consistency of my financial habits. But that morning, instinct nudged me toward it. Within moments, a chill ran through me. A large withdrawal had been made from my secondary savings account, the one I kept specifically for home repairs and emergency projects around the lake house. The transaction had occurred months earlier, yet I had never noticed its absence. My name appeared on the authorization, complete with my electronic signature, even though I had never approved it. At first, I wondered if it might have been a clerical error or a system glitch. But as I leaned closer to the screen, I saw the description beneath the transfer: funds sent to an account labeled Lunar Wells Retreat Holdings, a familiar name. Too familiar. My heart faltered. It was the same umbrella company that operated Olivia's retreat. I scrolled further, now with a tightening in my chest. The date of the transaction aligned perfectly with the time Olivia had mentioned needing temporary financial help for renovation expansions. She had spoken vaguely, insisting she would handle all the paperwork herself. Back then, I had assumed her request was innocently ambitious, not deceptive. I felt my hands tremble as I reached for the parcel from the previous day. Something about it had unsettled me, and now I needed to know why I opened the brochure again and sifted through the glossy pages. There, tucked between 2 folds, was a thin sheet I had overlooked. An invoice for wedding services, floral installations, lighting arrangements, venue decor, all billed under the name Maggie Whitford. A counterfeit signature sat neatly at the bottom. My breath caught. Olivia's wedding, Olivia's expenses, paid through my name. The humiliation hit first, swift and disorienting. Then came a deeper ache, the kind that hollowed the ribs and made every inhale hurt. I thought of all the times Olivia called to discuss money, always circling around the details, always deflecting questions. I had chalked it up to stress, adulthood, ambition. I had never imagined betrayal lived beneath it. I called the bank. The representative spoke cautiously, confirming that multiple recent invoices tied to Lunar Wells Retreat had indeed been approved through my email authorization. I informed her I had not approved anything. She hesitated, then said something I will never forget. Many young people assumed older adults did not check their accounts closely. As she continued talking, more information surfaced. The account receiving the funds belonged to a man named Brandon Hales. My pulse thudded louder. Brandon, Olivia's fiancé. When the representative mentioned he had a flagged history for financial misconduct in Arizona, my stomach dropped. The pieces no longer felt scattered. They aligned with brutal clarity. By the time I ended the call, a cold determination had settled into me. I stepped toward the window, watching the lake simmer beneath the afternoon light. Everything I believed about my daughter's life was shifting, slipping beyond recognition. I did not know the full truth yet, but I understood one thing with painful certainty. The betrayal ran deeper than a single text message. If my daughter had shut the door, I needed to know who had handed her the key. If you're still watching and sensing the storm forming, comment number 3 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's head into chapter 4. I woke the next morning with the weight of everything pressing against my ribs, heavy enough to slow my breathing, but not enough to keep me in bed. The lake outside my window was flat as glass, pale blue under the early sun, and for a brief moment, it made me wish the truth could be just as still. But the discovery I had made the day before pulsed like a bruise. I moved through the kitchen quietly, as if even the floorboards might protest the shift inside me. The silence of the lake house felt different now, less peaceful and more like a witness to something I had ignored for too long. I picked up my phone, determined to reach Olivia. My fingers hovered over the screen, typing half a message, deleting it, typing again. Every draft felt like begging, and I could not bear the taste of it. I tried calling instead. It rang once, then dropped into her voicemail. I tried again 20 minutes later, but the call failed before it even connected. The realization settled with a cold finality. She was not too busy. She was avoiding me. Frustration pushed me toward action. I remembered Thomas might know something about Brandon, even if I hated the idea of sounding desperate in front of my former husband. Still, I dialed him. When he finally answered, his voice carried surprise, then caution. I explained only the necessary parts. After a thoughtful silence, he admitted he had heard rumors about Brandon using family members to guarantee large payments. Hearing it spoken aloud tightened something inside my chest. My worst fears were not unreasonable. They were shared. Determined to gather proof, instead of drowning in speculation, I pulled out old messages from Olivia. Every temporary loan request, every heartfelt reassurance, every instance where she had told me that I was the only person she could trust. They all read differently now. I opened a folder of scanned documents. There were contracts for floral arrangements, venue deposits, decorator fees. All bore my name, my address, my signature. Only one of those belonged to me. I spread everything across the dining table until it resembled a map of betrayals. Papers rustled every time I walked past them, as if whispering what I had refused to hear. My legs carried me to my car, almost without thought. I drove to the office of my former attorney, Julia Mendez, who had once handled the paperwork for the lake house. She listened quietly as I explained. She turned over the document slowly, page by page, her brows drawing together. When she finally spoke, her words were clear. This was identity misuse, and possibly a criminal act. She told me to gather everything I could find, and she would prepare the first steps. The drive home felt longer than usual. I stopped at a roadside turnout overlooking the valley. From there, I opened the photo gallery Olivia had sent me weeks earlier, images of the wedding she said she was designing. Except now I saw exactly what I had missed. The arrangement styles were identical to the garden behind my lake house. Even the lighting pattern resembled the lantern hooks by my dock. Some images included Brandon in the background, arms crossed, supervising staff with a confidence that made my stomach twist. I needed to see their business for myself. I drove to the so-called headquarters of Lunar Wells Retreat. What I found was a dim, nearly abandoned suite in a quiet strip of offices. The blinds were drawn, the lights off. A neighbor in the next suite mentioned that Brandon only appeared a few times each month. It struck me then that everything I thought was established and thriving was a facade painted over thin canvas. On the way back, waves of anger and disbelief overtook me. I realized how many times Olivia had looked me in the eye while spinning these stories. The memories stung. But with each pang came a new clarity. If I did nothing, the deception would only grow. If I acted, I could still reclaim the pieces of my life that were left. When I reached the lake house, the sun was dipping low, throwing gold across the water. I gathered all the documents into a single folder. The stack was thicker now, heavier than I wanted it to be. I set it on the table, knowing that this was only the beginning. Something deeper waited beneath the surface, and I was finally willing to see it. If you're still watching and the conflict is pulling you deeper, comment number 4 below to show you're staying in this with me. Now, let's move to chapter 5. The folder of documents sat in front of me like a living thing, swelling with every new truth I had uncovered. I spread the pages across the dining table again, but this time the sight of them did not make me numb. It stirred something sharper, something that felt almost like heat beneath my skin. Each forged signature, each falsified contract, each invoice tied to my name formed a mosaic of a betrayal that had taken years to build. The lake outside remained calm, but I felt as if the entire world inside this home was shifting, cracking along a fault line I had ignored for far too long. When my phone vibrated, I did not expect anything meaningful. Perhaps a reminder, perhaps a promotional message. Instead, the words blinking on the screen made my breath stop. Olivia had sent me a single message. Do not call or come to the wedding. We are finished. There was no greeting, no explanation, no trace of the daughter I once raised. Just a clean, ruthless dismissal, as if I were an unruly guest on a list she was trimming. I read the sentence again, slower this time, hoping its cruelty would soften on the second pass. It did not. The memory that rose next was almost cruel in its timing. Olivia at 7 years old, laughing as she chased fireflies by the tree line near the cabin, she had run to me with cupped hands, showing me the glow like she had discovered magic. Her voice back then carried a sweetness that belonged to a different lifetime. Remembering it now made the distance between then and now even more unbearable. How did we become strangers wearing familiar faces? I sat down, picked up the phone, and typed my reply with a steadiness that surprised me. Got your last wish. The message was short, but it carried the weight of years. It was not revenge. It was closure, the only kind I could offer her in that moment. Still, as soon as I pressed send, I felt a tremor of something complicated. I wanted to be her mother, the one who forgave easily and endlessly. But I could no longer pretend that love meant erasing myself. I turned back to the documents, and that was when I saw the detail I had previously skimmed over. The wedding venue. My heart dropped. The location listed on the contract was not a rented estate or a public venue. It was my lake house, my property, the place I had kept alive for decades, filled with memories of my late husband and years of solitary healing. They had listed it publicly as if it were theirs to offer, theirs to control, theirs to reshape. It felt like someone had reached inside my home and rearranged the bones of it. Driven by a mix of disbelief and anger, I left the house and drove toward the property's entrance road. When I arrived, I saw people I did not know walking across my land, measuring the lawn, carrying equipment, holding blueprints of a ceremony layout. A string of lights was already hung across the old maple tree that my husband had planted the first year we moved here. It felt like watching strangers stage a play on the remains of something sacred. I could not speak. I simply observed, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers ached. When I finally turned away and drove back, the sun was sinking low behind the mountains. For the first time in years, my fear burned itself into resolve. I realized I had spent too long being erased politely. Back inside the lake house, I collected every document and emailed everything to Julia. She responded quickly, her tone firm. The situation was far more serious than she initially believed. What Olivia and Brandon had done was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation. Julia said the law could support me if I chose to pursue this fully. I closed my phone and stepped outside onto the porch. The lake reflected the orange glow of sunset, a quiet contrast to the storm building within me. I placed my hand on the thick folder, feeling the rough edges of the paper like armor. I had crossed a threshold, one I could not return from. For the first time, I felt not devastation, but readiness. Morning came without mercy. I had drifted in and out of sleep, caught between exhaustion and the relentless churn of thoughts that refused to quiet. The first light of day slipped across the wooden floor of the lake house, touching the stack of documents I had left on the dining table. The papers seemed to glow in the soft light, as if insisting I face what they represented. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind hope or old memories. The decision that waited for me felt larger than I was prepared to hold, yet it sat there, patient, steady, impossible to ignore. I sat at the table and let my fingers brush the edges of the documents. Each one felt like a thin slice of the years I had spent giving Olivia the benefit of every doubt. The loans, the signatures, the lies wrapped in affection. They stared back at me now with unapologetic clarity. Every time I hesitated, the same question echoed inside me. If I did nothing, what would they take next? It was a frightening question because the answer came too easily. Everything. They would take everything. My heart dragged me in the opposite direction, reminding me that Olivia was still my daughter, that there had once been love, trust, a bond that had shaped decades of my life. I found myself revisiting old scenes of her childhood, moments of laughter, moments where she had needed me and I had answered without hesitation. Yet with each memory came the cold truth that the woman she had become was no longer guided by those moments. She had crossed a line long before I realized it existed. I stepped away from the table to clear my head, pacing slowly through the quiet rooms. Every shadow in the house carried a reminder of the life I had built with care, steady and honest. My husband's photograph hung near the fireplace, his calm eyes seeming to follow me as I moved past. I could almost hear his measured voice telling me not to hand my life to those who would waste it. The thought settled in my chest like a stone, heavy but grounding. Finally, I returned to the table and picked up my phone. My hands did not tremble this time. I called Julia Mendez, and when she answered, I told her I was ready to proceed. She explained the options with her usual clarity. I could take the softer route and send a warning, or I could take action that would stop the wedding entirely and reclaim my property through the court. She reminded me that the law was on my side, that what Olivia and Brandon had done was not a misunderstanding, but a violation. Her calm conviction steadied me. When I ended the call, I knew the decision had already been made. I stepped outside to breathe. The lake was smooth under the morning light, the trees swaying gently, as if nothing in the world had shifted. I walked the familiar path around the edge of the water, feeling the comfort of every stone and root beneath my feet. This land had held my grief, my healing, my second beginning. It belonged to me in ways no contract could ever fully express. To surrender it now would be to surrender myself. When I re-entered the house, I opened Julia's email and replied with a firm confirmation. She would file the necessary documents within 48 hours. There was no turning back. I gathered every remaining piece of evidence, scanned them, and placed the physical copies in a sturdy folder. As I worked, a strange clarity settled over me. It was neither victory nor relief. It was acceptance, the beginning of a new boundary drawn not out of anger, but out of survival. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun lowered behind the hills. The folder lay on my lap, heavier than its weight suggested. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like steadiness return to me. I had chosen the only path that allowed me to keep my life intact. Whatever storm came next, I would face it standing, not shrinking. If you're still watching and the turning point hit you hard, comment number 6 below so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's continue with Chapter 7. The morning the filing became official, I woke with a tightness in my chest that felt like the moment before a storm breaks open. The lake house was unusually still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel sharper. I checked my phone and found an email from Julia confirming that the petition had been submitted to the county court. Seeing it in writing made everything real in a way that even my own decision the day before had not. The process had begun, and there was no way to take it back. Within an hour, my phone began vibrating in frantic bursts. Unknown numbers, short emails, notifications piling in one after another. At first, I ignored them. Then curiosity won over, and I opened my messages. Brandon had sent a long chain of complaints, filled with indignation and veiled warnings. He insisted that I was sabotaging their future, that I was overreacting, that I would regret what I had done. His words carried a familiar smugness, as if he still believed he held some kind of power over me. He did not. Not anymore. Vendors began calling next, their voices anxious and rushed. They wanted to confirm whether the lake house truly lacked a valid permit for the event. Others had heard rumors that the wedding might be canceled and wanted immediate clarification. Their urgency made it clear that Olivia had built the entire production on false foundations. As the calls continued, the shape of the chaos became clearer. The wedding was beginning to unravel. Needing air, I stepped outside and walked along the path that circled the property. The water was dark and reflective, shaken occasionally by the breeze. Even the trees seemed uneasy, their branches shifting, as if feeling an echo of the tension that wrapped around the house. It struck me then how much of my life had been lived in quiet service to others, trusting their intentions without protecting my own. That time was over. Just after midday, 2 county officers arrived in a marked vehicle. They stepped out, calm and courteous, and explained that they were there to complete the inspection required by the filing. I walked with them to the entrance of the property, watching as they affixed a large notice of cancellation directly onto the gate. The sound of the adhesive tape pressing against metal felt final, like a gavel striking. They photographed the posting for their records before driving away. I stood in the driveway long after their car disappeared. Word spread faster than I expected. Cars I did not recognize slowed near the gate. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves lingered outside longer than usual, glancing toward the property with thinly masked curiosity. A few people paused to whisper among themselves. I felt exposed, as if the entire town had been given a window into a part of my life I would have preferred to keep private. The first email from a journalist arrived that afternoon, a polite inquiry, asking whether I wished to share my perspective. Julia's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me to stay silent, so I deleted the message without replying. Still, knowing the press had caught wind of the situation made my stomach twist. I had not wanted a spectacle. I had only wanted my home and my dignity restored. Later that day, Olivia finally sent her own message. It was long and furious, filled with accusations that painted her as the wounded party. She insisted I had betrayed her, that I had destroyed her dreams and humiliated her. Reading it felt like pressing on a bruise. The words hurt, but they did not have the power they once had. Something in me had shifted too deeply to be reversed. As evening settled over the lake house, I stood on the porch looking out at the darkening sky, listening to a distant engine approach and fade again. The world around me seemed to hold its breath. The consequences of my choice were unfolding faster than I had imagined, and the truth pressed against me like a weight. Whatever happened next, nothing would return to the way it was. I found myself wondering whether I was losing my daughter or simply seeing her clearly for the first time. The morning that followed felt strangely weightless, as if the noise from the previous days had been rinsed out of the air. I woke before sunrise, not from worry but from an unfamiliar calm. The lake outside my window was still, holding a thin silver sheen of dawn. I moved slowly through the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee the way I used to before life turned into a long corridor of anxiety. The quiet did not frighten me anymore. It felt like a room I had finally earned the right to enter. As I sat with my cup, I became aware of a deep exhaustion that had been living inside me for months. It was not dramatic or sudden, but a steady pulse of truth. I had spent too long carrying a weight built from Olivia's demands, Brandon's deceit, and my own refusal to let go. Admitting that weariness did not weaken me, it steadied me. For the first time, I allowed myself to sit without rushing to fix, explain, or justify anything. Julia called mid-morning, her voice measured and clear. She told me the chaos had rattled Olivia and Brandon more than they would ever admit. Their legal footing was unstable, and their reaction had already attracted the wrong kind of attention from the wrong people. Julia advised me to prepare for the next phase, fortifying my image, keeping every document in order, and refusing any public engagement. She reminded me gently to think about what life would look like after all of this was over, not just what I was fighting against now. After the call, I walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. I passed the small library I had abandoned, the garden gloves sitting untouched, the notebooks with half-written stories. I suddenly realized how many pieces of myself I had tucked away, convinced I did not have the right to tend to them. The grief of that realization stung, but it was honest pain, the kind that clears space for something better. I stepped outside to feel the sun warming the porch boards. A neighbor from up the hill approached, greeting me with cautious kindness. She told me some folks knew bits of what was happening and wanted me to know I was not alone. Her words were simple, but they landed softly in a place I had kept guarded. When I returned inside, I felt different. I sat at the dining table and wrote a small list of things I could reclaim: my routines, my boundaries, and the pieces of my future that still belonged to me. My world had not healed overnight, but it had shifted. The tightness in my chest loosened, replaced by the faintest sense of direction. By sunset, I stood on the porch, watching the lake glow orange. For the first time in a very long time, I felt myself breathing fully, not as Olivia's mother or as a target of betrayal, but simply as a woman reclaiming her life. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of what's ahead, comment number 8 below to let me know you're walking toward the ending with me. Now, let's move closer to the final chapters. The morning arrived soft and pale, carrying with it a quiet Mason had not felt in years. Sunlight drifted across the lake like a thin sheet of gold, touching the porch and warming the wooden planks beneath his bare feet. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence fold around him, realizing that the storm he had endured had finally passed. There were no new accusations in his inbox, no demands disguised as apologies, no chaotic messages from Olivia or her fiancé. The world felt strangely still. His phone buzzed only once, and it was Julia's name on the screen. Her voice was calm as she explained that the court had dismissed the lawsuit entirely. The judge had found Brandon and Olivia's claims baseless, and in an unexpected turn, had assigned the legal fees to them. The city had also begun an official inquiry into Olivia's business practices. The foundation she had built her career on had crumbled, not because Mason pushed it down, but because it had never been stable to begin with. After the call, he sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It was simply his home again, He noticed the way the morning light settled gently on the framed photographs of his late wife, on the stack of unpaid bills he no longer dreaded, on the quiet corners that had once been filled with anxiety. The absence of conflict felt like a kind of grace. Later that afternoon, he received one last message from Olivia. The tone was weary, stripped of the anger that had fueled the previous days. She wrote that she had lost everything, that she did not know how to move forward. Mason read the words slowly, recognizing the grief inside them, but he also understood that he was not responsible for carrying it. He placed the phone face down without replying. He spent the rest of the day sorting through old papers in his office, gathering anything tied to the long chain of manipulations he had endured. He placed the documents into a cardboard box and sealed it. The sound of the tape pulling across the surface felt like closing a door. When the sun began to sink behind the trees, Mason walked down to the water. The sky glowed amber, reflected in the still surface of the lake. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He had not won a battle. He had simply reclaimed his life. The morning rose slowly over the lake, casting a soft shimmer across the water, as if the world itself were exhaling after a long, weary battle. Mason stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, worn smooth by years of weather and memory. The quiet was not the heavy kind that follows fear. It was gentle, earned, and full of space. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though the day belonged entirely to him. He moved through the house with an ease that surprised him. Each room had once echoed with tension, but now held a calm clarity. In the study, he sat at his desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, not to fight, not to defend, but to release. He began writing a letter addressed to Olivia, though he knew it would never be mailed. The words came slowly, shaped by honesty rather than anger. He wrote about the weight of truth, the cost of deceit, and the kind of love that cannot survive without respect. He folded the letter carefully and placed it into a small wooden box, closing it like a gentle farewell. Later that afternoon, Marianne and Jackson joined him for dinner. They spoke about simple things, the kind that root a person back into life, the shifting seasons, the stubborn rosebush near the porch, Jackson's attempt to fix his old boat engine. No one mentioned Olivia. No one needed to. Their quiet companionship filled the house with something steadier than joy, something like restoration. After they left, Mason stepped outside again. The porch light cast a soft glow across the boards, and the lake mirrored the fading sky in calm ripples. He let the silence settle over him, realizing he was no longer waiting for an apology or a phone call or a reconciliation that would never come. He had chosen peace over chaos, dignity over desperation, himself over the illusion of family. As the evening deepened, Mason breathed in the cool air and felt a gentle certainty bloom inside him. Letting go had not broken him. It had saved him. And in that moment, he understood the message life had been trying to teach him. Love must be honest, or it is not love at all. In the end, every storm reveals more than it destroys. It strips away the illusions we cling to, leaving behind the quiet truth of who we are when the noise fades. Healing does not always arrive as reconciliation. Sometimes it comes as the strength to walk forward alone, to reclaim the space where dignity can grow again. Life has a way of teaching that love without honesty is only a shadow, and peace begins the moment we stop the bargaining with what was never real. The journey may bend us, but it also sharpens our sense of what deserves to stay. Thank you for sharing your time and heart with this story. If it moved you, challenged you, or made you think, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment and join our community by following and subscribing for more stories that speak to the soul.